In the winter of 1914, when the world was already shaking under the weight of the First World War, a man named Douglas Mawson faced one of the most terrifying survival stories in human history. Most people today have never heard of him, yet his journey remains one of the greatest examples of endurance, intelligence, and pure willpower ever recorded. The story begins in the frozen wilderness of Antarctica. At that time, Antarctica was still largely unexplored. Many brave explorers were trying to discover its secrets. One of the most famous explorers of that era was Douglas Mawson, a quiet but determined scientist from Australia. Unlike many explorers who were searching for glory, Mawson was more interested in science. He wanted to study the land, the ice, and the strange environment of the southern continent. In 1911, Mawson led an expedition known as the Australasian Antarctic Expedition. Their mission was to explore the unknown parts of Antarctica and collect scientific data that could help the world understand the harshest place on Earth. At first, everything seemed promising. Mawson and his team built a small base called Cape Denison. It quickly became known as one of the windiest places on the planet. Hurricane-force winds blasted the camp almost every day. Even stepping outside could feel like walking into a wall of ice knives. Despite the brutal conditions, the team continued their work. They studied weather patterns, glaciers, wildlife, and magnetic fields. But Mawson had an even bigger goal. He wanted to explore far into the unknown interior of Antarctica. In late 1912, Mawson prepared a dangerous sledging journey with two companions, Belgrave Ninnis and Xavier Mertz. They packed their sledges with supplies, scientific equipment, and dogs to pull their loads. The plan was simple: travel hundreds of miles across the frozen continent, gather information, and return safely to base. But Antarctica had other plans. For weeks, the three men traveled across endless white landscapes. The silence was overwhelming. There were no trees, no animals, no sounds except the wind and the crunch of snow beneath their boots. Every day they moved deeper into unknown territory. Then disaster struck. One afternoon, while traveling across a seemingly solid surface, Ninnis stepped onto what looked like normal snow, but underneath was a hidden crevasse, a massive crack in the glacier. In a split second, the ground collapsed. Ninnis, along with the strongest sled, the best dogs, and most of the expedition's food, plunged into the icy darkness below. The fall was hundreds of feet deep. Mawson and Mertz rushed to the edge of the crevasse. They shouted his name again and again. There was no response. Within seconds, nearly all their supplies were gone. The situation was now terrifying. Mawson and Mertz were more than 300 miles away from their base, with only a fraction of their food remaining. Turning back was the only option, but the journey back would be brutal. With most of the food lost, the men were forced to do something desperate. They began eating their dogs one by one to survive. Each day became harder than the last. The Antarctic wind screamed across the ice. Temperatures dropped far below freezing. Their bodies grew weaker from hunger and exhaustion. But an even stranger problem began to appear. After weeks of eating the dogs, Mertz began to become very sick. His skin started peeling. His hair began falling out. He felt constant pain in his stomach. Today, scientists believe this illness was caused by eating dog liver, which contains extremely high levels of vitamin A. Too much vitamin A can poison the human body. Mertz grew weaker every day. Eventually, he could no longer walk properly. In January 1913, after weeks of suffering, Xavier Mertz died in the frozen wilderness. Now, Mawson was completely alone. Hundreds of miles from safety, no rescue, no help, no guarantee of survival. Most people would have given up, but Mawson refused. He packed what little food remained onto the sled and began the long journey back to Cape Denison. Every step was painful. His body was failing. The skin on his feet was peeling away. His gums bled constantly, but he kept moving. Then another disaster happened. One day, while crossing the ice, Mawson himself fell into a crevasse. He dropped suddenly into darkness, but by pure luck, the sled he was pulling got stuck at the top, stopping his fall. Mawson dangled in the freezing void, hundreds of feet above the bottom. For a moment, it seemed impossible to escape, but Mawson had prepared for emergencies. He slowly climbed up the rope attached to the sled, pulling himself back towards the surface. Several times he slipped and nearly fell again. Finally, exhausted and shaking, he crawled back onto solid ground. Many explorers would have considered this the end, but Mawson continued. Day after day, he dragged the sled across the ice, alone. To make his load lighter, he even cut his sled in half using a saw, creating a smaller, easier-to-pull sled. This simple idea probably saved his life. Weeks passed. The weather became worse. Mawson suffered from snow blindness and could barely see. His face was burned by the freezing wind. But one thought kept him going: home. After nearly 2 months of solo travel across Antarctica, Mawson finally saw something unbelievable on the horizon: the distant outline of his expedition base, Cape Denison. He had done the impossible. But the story was not finished yet. When Mawson arrived, he discovered that the main expedition ship had already left just hours earlier. The rest of the team had been waiting for weeks, believing he had died. By incredible luck, the ship had left behind a small group of men who were still finishing scientific work. Mawson had survived long enough to reach them. His survival shocked the world. Historians still consider his journey one of the greatest survival stories ever recorded in polar exploration. Even among the legendary explorers of the time, Mawson's determination stood out. Many famous explorers, including Ernest Shackleton and Roald Amundsen, faced incredible challenges in Antarctica. Yet Mawson's solo return across hundreds of miles of frozen wilderness remains one of the most unbelievable. His expedition proved something powerful. Human endurance can go far beyond what we imagine. Douglas Mawson eventually returned home as a hero, but he never described himself that way. To him, the expedition was simply part of the pursuit of knowledge and exploration. Today, more than a century later, scientists and historians still study his journey for lessons in survival, leadership, and resilience. The frozen continent of Antarctica remains one of the most dangerous places on Earth. Storms can appear suddenly. Temperatures can drop lower than -80 degrees Fahrenheit. Crevasses hide beneath the snow like invisible traps. Yet explorers continue to go there. And every time they do, the story of Douglas Mawson reminds them of what one determined human being can endure. In the endless white silence of Antarctica, where the wind never truly stops and the horizon stretches forever, Mawson's footsteps became a symbol of courage. A man alone against the harshest environment on the planet, and somehow, against every possible odds, he walked out alive.